In this video, we are going to head over to Sicily, because there is a lot going on in Sicily. We are going to stay in the same year though, 214 BC. Events began to spiral out of control in Syracuse. There was a lot of political maneuvering going on. Mainly that's because their longtime leader, Hiero, had died in the previous year. That's similar to today, by the way. When you have a longtime leader die, a lot of times that can lead to political upheaval. And this became a problem for Rome. A big problem that Rome was determined to deal with one way or the other. So as I mentioned, Hiero, the tyrant of Syracuse, has died. 5 decades earlier, Hiero had concluded a treaty with Rome during the First Punic War. This greatly helped Rome as Rome was able to establish a permanent base in Sicily. And that also allowed the Romans to launch attacks deeper into Sicily. After the war, Hiero remained loyal to the Romans, and even maintained a powerful fleet to defend Sicily from invasion. But with Hiero's death, Rome's situation in Sicily changed literally overnight. Control of the city passed to Hiero's grandson, Hieronymus. The problem was that Hieronymus was only in his teens, and in no position to rule the most important city in Sicily. Livy states that Hiero foresaw the potential problems with a boy ruler in charge, and wanted to return Syracuse to, quote, a free state. However, Hiero's 2 daughters bitterly opposed this. They were convinced that they and their husbands could administer the city, and that Hieronymus would retain the title of king in name only. Hiero, who was already in his 90s, was too weak to resist his family. Instead, he decided to place 15 guardians around his grandson. Livy states that on his deathbed, Hiero begged anyone that would listen to maintain friendly relations with Rome. Well, after Hiero's death, it didn't take long for the problems to start. Andronodorus, who was the son-in-law of Hiero, purged all of the guardians that Hiero had so carefully put in place. Andronodorus felt Hieronymus was more than capable of assuming control of the great city. Well, you had to know this was going to end very badly. Livy states that Hieronymus dressed himself in purple and always moved around the city in a chariot that was drawn by 4 white horses. This was quite the contrast from Hiero, who always approached everything with modesty. To make matters worse, Hieronymus became a terror to everyone around him, such that many in Syracuse feared for their very lives. Livy states that only 3 advisors were allowed into the palace: Andronodorus and Zoippus, who were married to Hiero's daughters. The other man was named Thraso. Andronodorus and Zoippus wanted to ally with Carthage, especially after Rome's catastrophic defeat at Cannae. Thraso was the lone voice that favored maintaining Syracuse's old alliance with Rome. The 2 sides argued constantly over who to ally with. Andronodorus and Zoippus finally decided to conspire against Thraso. They accused Thraso of plotting to kill Hieronymus. False witnesses were produced, and that was enough to convince the young king of Thrasos's guilt. With Thrasos out of the way, Hieronymus dispatched messengers to Hannibal. Hannibal had just won the Battle of Cannae, and so it seemed like a wise decision, at least to a young teenager who likely saw Hannibal almost as a rock star. Soon a great alliance would be formed between Hannibal and Syracuse. The Roman praetor in Sicily was Appius Claudius. When news reached him of Syracuse's defection, he immediately dispatched envoys to Syracuse. The envoys wanted to renew Rome's alliance with Syracuse. When the envoys arrived, however, Hieronymus mocked them about the results of the Battle of Cannae. The Roman envoys steadfastly warned the young king not to abandon his alliance with Rome. Hieronymus apparently didn't heed their advice and concluded an alliance with Carthage. And with that, Hieronymus mobilized the Syracusan army. He decided to fortify Leontini, which was a town that was situated close to the border of Roman-held territory in Sicily. But by now, elements in the army were conspiring against Hieronymus. As the young king passed a gatehouse, he was attacked by several soldiers that had been lying in wait. Hieronymus was stabbed to death, and by the time his supporters and bodyguards arrived, the assassins had fled. A civil war now loomed between the pro-Carthaginian faction and the pro-Roman faction. With Syracuse hanging in the balance, Appius sent word to the Senate that Rome was in serious danger of losing Sicily. Appius quickly moved all the Roman garrisons in Sicily up to the border that separated Roman territory from Syracuse. The mere suggestion that Rome might lose Sicily was enough to energize the Roman Senate, and even though Hieronymus had been assassinated, the situation still hung in the balance. Rome had fought so hard to win the First Punic War, and its grand prize was Sicily. They weren't about to give up their first province without a fight. Marcellus in 214 BC was therefore placed in charge of all Roman forces in Sicily. Meanwhile, in Syracuse, Andronodorus had received advance word that Hieronymus had been assassinated. Before the army could even arrive, Andronodorus garrisoned the citadel and closed the gates to another strong point called the Island. The assassins, meanwhile, displayed the blood-stained robe of Hieronymus for all the citizens citizens of Syracuse to see. The people of Syracuse now saw their chance for absolute freedom. The Senate of Syracuse, which had been largely ignored by Hieronymus, now sent messengers to Adranodorus. Adranodorus was urged by his wife, Demerata, a daughter of Hiero, to resist the Senate and immediately seize power. However, Adranodorus ignored his wife and decided to play the role of peacemaker, and so he offered the keys to the citadel to the Syracusan Senate. Amazingly, the next day Adranodorus was elected as a praetor. His political maneuver had worked. His victory was short-lived, though, as a few days later Adranodorus was assassinated as he entered the Senate. Themisttus, a close ally of Adranodorus, was also taken out. Syracuse was indeed in a very turbulent state, with various factions pushing for an alliance with Carthage and other factions pushing for Rome. The Syracusan Senate was content to let the assassination of Adranodorus pass, but the people of Syracuse demanded an investigation. The Senate investigation focused on Adranodorus and basically came to the conclusion that he was conspiring against the citizens of Syracuse and planning to seize absolute power for himself. Meanwhile, the pro-Roman faction wanted more blood. The daughters of Hiero were the next target. They all sought refuge in a temple. Heraclea begged for the lives of her own daughters. The assassins, however, refused to listen and killed Heraclea and her 2 young daughters, as well as Harmonia and Demerata. According to Livy, this changed the hearts of people in Syracuse, who felt the pro-Roman faction had gone too far. Now the people insisted on an election to fill the places of Adranodorus and Themisttus. 2 pro-Carthaginian replacements were elected, Epicides and Hippocrates. They were born in Syracuse but had fought previously in the Carthaginian army. Previously, when it seemed the Roman faction would win out, they had asked to be restored to Hannibal. But now, with the chaos going on in Syracuse, they saw an opportunity to take advantage of the changed situation and switch Syracuse's loyalty permanently to Carthage. Meanwhile, the Syracusan Senate dispatched 2 envoys to arrange a temporary truce with Appius Claudius. The Romans had a 100-ship fleet awaiting further orders, but in the short term, the Romans were content to wait and see what transpired in Syracuse. Also, Marcellus finally arrived in Sicily, and he favored renewing the original treaty with Syracuse. He dispatched envoys to negotiate directly with the Syracusan Senate. A fierce debate took place in the Syracusan Senate, with some senators hoping to take the side of Rome and others the side of Carthage. Eventually, the Roman faction won out again and decided to negotiate a peace treaty with Marcellus. Then a curious incident occurred that would change everything. A delegation from Leontini arrived requesting an armed force from Syracuse. The Roman faction in Syracuse decided this was a golden opportunity to get rid of as many undesirables as they could. In other words, the pro-Carthaginian faction. The Senate decided to send a force of 4,000 mercenaries and appointed Hippocrates as the leader. Hippocrates, of course, was a huge supporter of Carthage, so why not get him out of Syracuse? This would turn out to be a monumental lapse in judgment by the Syracusan Senate. Hippocrates' original orders were to garrison Leontini. Hippocrates, however, had other ideas. En route to Leontini, he decided to plunder the land surrounding Rome's allies. Appius responded by sending a detachment to protect the land from pillaging. Hippocrates was able to easily rout the detachment Appius had sent. An enraged Marcellus dispatched a message to Syracuse stating that the treaty had been violated and Syracuse had chosen war. Marcellus made it quite clear that the only hope for peace was to have both Epicides and Hippocrates banned from not only Syracuse but all of Sicily. Upon hearing this, Epicides fled from Syracuse to Leontini. Marcellus now ordered a 2-pronged attack against Leontini. He would attack on one side while Appius was ordered to attack from the opposite side. But before the order was given, Marcellus wanted to make one last attempt for a negotiated surrender. However, before the negotiations could take place, Roman troops, enraged over the attack against the detachment, lost all discipline and stormed Leontini. The Romans smashed right through Leontini's defenses and easily gained possession of the walls and the city's main gate. In the dead of the night, Epicides and Hippocrates decided Leontini was a lost cause and fled the city. Meanwhile, the Syracusans had dispatched another army of 8,000 to Leontini to arrest Hippocrates for treason. While the army was on the march, they were approached by Epicides and Hippocrates. They relayed the terrible news that Leontini had fallen and the Romans were massacring and butchering the population, which included Syracusans. Livy states that the opposite was actually true. Although many citizens of Leontini were killed in the initial attack, Marcellus had actually stopped the looting and returned all of the plundered property back to the citizens. Still, the Syracusan army believed Epicides. The army mutinied and returned to Syracuse to depose the pro-Roman Senate. In Syracuse, the general population was angered at the Romans for the atrocities committed at Leontini. army. There was also a general fear that the Romans would commit the same crimes in Syracuse. The decision was made to fortify the gates and the city's defenses were prepared. Hippocrates and Epicides were once again confirmed as the leaders of the Syracusan Senate, and the pro-Roman Senate faction was removed from power. Marcellus received the news of the latest events in Syracuse. He immediately broke camp and marched from Leontini to Syracuse. Once the Romans reached the outskirts of Syracuse, they set up camp at the Temple of Jupiter. Marcellus still held out for a new treaty and dispatched more envoys. Hippocrates and Epicides met the Roman delegation at the city's main gate, but barred them from entering. The Roman envoys demanded once again that Hippocrates and Epicides turn themselves in, and then and only then would there be peace. Epicides' only reply was to shut the gates on the Roman envoys. And with that, the Romans moved up a fantastic amount of siege equipment. Except that there was one obstacle in their way, and it was a massive one. Archimedes. I don't think I can state this any better than Livy. An assault begun so vigorously would have undoubtedly succeeded had it not been for one man living at the time in Syracuse. That man was Archimedes. Unrivaled as he was as an observer of the heavens and stars, he was still more wonderful as the inventor and creator of military works and engines by which, with very little trouble, he was able to baffle the most laborious efforts of the enemy. Marcellus first planned a sea attack against the city. He attacked with 60 quinqueremes. It was an attack on the grand scale. Ships were equipped with both archers and light infantry. Some ships were fastened together, which allowed them to carry battering rams and towers for attacking the seaside walls of Syracuse. Archimedes countered by placing all sorts of catapults on the ramparts. Massive stones were lobbed at the Roman ships, causing immense damage. He also made it possible for the archers to fire their arrows without exposing themselves to any danger. But the real game changer was the so-called Claw of Archimedes. Ancient historians describe the claw as a gigantic crane that was equipped with some sort of grappling hook. It was so powerful it could lift an attacking ship partly out of the water. The ship was then either capsized or smashed right back into the sea. Livy states that this device alone effectively put an end to the Roman attack from sea. With the attack from sea broken, the Romans looked to win the battle on land. But the attack from land was also doomed to frustration and failure. Archimedes had spent years preparing the land's defenses, and the Roman attackers were no match for his burning genius. The wall was too steep to be scaled, and the extreme height made it easy for the Syracusans to rain down missiles and stones upon the Romans. Thus, the land assault also failed. At this point, the Romans decided to call off the attack. The decision was made to blockade Syracuse by land and sea. The Romans would simply starve the Syracusans into submission. 2/3 of the army was left to maintain the blockade. The other third, led by Marcellus, would attack cities around Sicily that had sided with Carthage. Many cities didn't even bother taking on the Romans, and immediately submitted to Rome. Megara, however, refused and was raised as an example to the rest of Sicily. This made a serious impression on the other cities whose loyalties to Rome were wavering. Meanwhile, Carthage decided to take advantage of the chaos in Sicily. A large army of 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 12 elephants was dispatched to Sicily. The Carthaginian force immediately captured several cities. This greatly boosted the morale of the Syracusans and the rest of the cities in Sicily that had sided with Carthage. In Syracuse, Epicides decided to take command of the defense of Syracuse. Hippocrates, on the other hand, would launch spoiler attacks against the Roman army that surrounded Syracuse. By night, Hippocrates was able to slip past the Roman lines and move his army out into the open. Meanwhile, Marcellus tried to garrison Agrigentum, but found it already had fallen to the Carthaginians. He marched his force back to Syracuse, but on the way was surprised to see the Carthaginian army. Since Marcellus only had 1/3 of his army, he decided to avoid a direct confrontation. He also spotted Hippocrates with his Syracusan army while they were building their camp. Without hesitation, Marcellus launched a surprise attack. The Syracusans were forced into a headlong retreat in complete disarray. Hippocrates was eventually able to link up with the Carthaginian army, and together they camped about 8 miles away from Syracuse. Livy states that a Carthaginian fleet of 55 ships sailed right into the great harbor of Syracuse. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate dispatched another legion to Sicily. Livy states that the amount of attention being given to Sicily was so great that, quote, it looked as if the war had been wholly diverted from Italy. The presence of the Carthaginian army caused serious problems for Rome. Cities around Sicily were now energized to revolt against Rome. Roman garrisons were expelled from several cities. Those garrisons that refused to leave were, quote, treacherously overpowered. One of the last garrisons to hold out was situated at Enna. Enna was thought to be almost impregnable. The city was situated on the summit of a large mountain. It was surrounded on all sides by steep and jagged cliffs. Furthermore, the city was located right in the middle of Sicily, so it was absolutely imperative that Rome hold the stronghold, or all of Sicily might be lost. The Roman garrison commander, aware of what was transpiring in the other Sicilian cities, resisted all of the measures taken by the citizens of Enna. The citizens tried one last ruse. They summoned the Roman commander and asked for the keys to the citadel, as a sign of trust. The Roman commander replied, "I have been placed in charge of here by my commanding officer. It is from him that I have received the keys of the gates and the custody of the citadel. I do not hold these things at my own disposal, or at the disposal of the citizens of Enna, but at the disposal of the man who committed them to my charge. To quit one's post is with the Romans a capital offense, and fathers have even punished it as such in the case of their own children. The Consul Marcellus is not far away. Send to him. He has the right and authority to act in the matter." The Roman commander then returned to the citadel, and realizing the graveness of the situation, said, "I think, soldiers, you have heard what happened lately, and how Roman garrisons have been surprised and overwhelmed by the Sicilians. That treachery you have escaped, in the first place by the good providence of the gods, and next by your own steady courage and by your own persistent watchfulness, and remaining under arms night and day. I only hope the rest of our time may be spent without suffering or inflicting things too horrible to speak of. The precautions we have taken so far have been against secret treachery. As that has proven unsuccessful, they are now openly demanding the keys of the gates. And no sooner will they be delivered than Enna will be in the power of the Carthaginians, and we here shall be butchered with a greater cruelty than the garrison of Mergantia. I have succeeded with difficulty in getting one night allowed for deliberation, so that I could inform you of the impending peril. At daybreak they are going to hold an assembly of the people, at which they will fling charges against me, and stir up the populace against you. So tomorrow Enna will run with blood, either yours or that of its own citizens. Victory will fall to him who first draws the sword, so all be on the alert and wait attentively for the signal. I shall be in the assembly and will spin out the time by speaking and arguing till everything is perfectly ready. And when I give the signal with my toga, raise a loud shout and make an attack on the crowd from all sides, and cut everything down with the sword, and take care that nothing survives from which either open violence or treachery is to be feared." The next morning, the Roman officer entered into the city's theater to meet with Enna's assembly. Once again, the keys were demanded, and once again the commander made it quite clear that he answered only to the Roman consul. At that point, the citizens of Enna charged the Roman commander with the obvious intent of killing him. On cue, the commander signaled his men. The Roman soldiers rushed the theater and quickly blocked off the exits. The citizens of Enna were no match for Roman legionnaires, and were cut to pieces. After the theater was finished off, the Roman soldiers stormed the rest of the city. No mercy was shown, and so Enna was saved, as well as the Roman situation in Sicily. After this incident, all sides began to set up winter quarters. Marcellus allowed Appius Claudius to return to Rome. Appius was seeking election to the next consulship.